All right, we are ready to continue on to our next session. We're going to discuss the sons of God. And a couple things before I get going too far on this one. Number one, I feel like I've left a few open threads in the first couple sessions, and that was kind of out of, it's a byproduct of how this is going to go, but I'm going to try to bring these back around. But one of the questions I kind of want to address by the time we get to the end of the conference, which would be tomorrow, is how did spiritual warfare play into getting us to where we are now? Because it's not just that spiritual warfare exists, but it has had an impact on the course of mankind in many ways. We just saw one significant one, obviously, in Genesis chapter 3. But I believe the reason we got to where we are today and the way God's dealing with us today is a byproduct of this battle that's been going on ever since. So we'll start to see hopefully a development of that. I just kind of wanted to plant that thought in your mind a little bit. Also, before I get into it, it's almost becoming impossible nowadays to discuss the phrase of the sons of God, Genesis chapter 6, the giants, without going into the book of Enoch at one point. So I wanted to throw out my disclaimer on this. Yes, I will reference it a touch. It's one of the few books I will bring up. Part of that's because there are writers in scriptures that quote from it, so it's kind of hard to avoid if you do want to avoid it. My personal position on the book of Enoch is that I have no problem considering it a non-inspired book, but it does seem to be information that the writers of scripture were using as truth for the audience they were presenting, at least in the sections that they were doing, by inspiration no less. So there's a few things that Enoch brings up that kind of make some connections, otherwise that seem sort of, and maybe they're there, maybe they're not. And you guys can take and do with that as you will when those situations come up. My goal generally is to try to stick as close to scripture alone as much as possible, but sometimes bringing something in from a different location helps, just like using illustrations and so on and so forth. But my disclaimer, I'm not arguing that the book of Enoch should be in the canon of scripture necessarily, but it does develop some consistencies, and Jude actually quotes it virtually word for a section. So apparently it seems to have had some value, especially when it comes to this subject matter. And that's because that's really about the only time it does seem to show up that I'm aware of. So the book of Enoch gets referenced. That's kind of where it starts in at. But we're gonna see if we can't argue this, or my position at least, is exclusively from Scripture as possible. Secondly, or thirdly at this point, I guess, my focus is going to be the sons of God largely and their role in the situation and in following that through. But you can't come this far into the subject and not talk about the giants a little bit. So we're going to see what we can do about weaving both things into the mix a little bit. But on that note, we will start picking up here in Genesis chapter 6. So we had the fall happen. Things have been trending pretty poorly since that time. Man's kicked out of the garden, out into the wilderness. And for the record, I don't think the wilderness was... Sometimes, once again, you go back to the kids' books and you've got the beautiful, lush, lovely garden, and then you see the wall of shrubbery and the angel standing at the gate, and everything beyond it's barren ground with thorns the size of dogs and the whole 9 yards. And not to say that there wasn't a curse on the ground and all that, but my understanding is God didn't create it that way necessarily. It's just it hadn't been cultivated, tended, and kept as the garden was, and I believe initially that's what they were supposed to do, was to continue God's work as a mankind and carry that to the ends of the earth, if I can use that phrase. And obviously, we got a little hitch in the plan when Adam and Eve got kicked out. And of course, Cain and Abel, you've got that whole scenario. Cain kills his brother, and that basically sets the tone for the next several chapters of Genesis. By the time you get to chapter 6, it says, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." I'm pretty solidly convinced I'm preaching to the choir in this one, but the sons of God, there's kind of two competing theories. One is that the sons of God are the descendants of Seth. after Abel is killed, Eve has another son, and she says, oh, I've been given a son from the Lord, and it says, and then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. So the one argument is you've got these guys who came down through Seth's family tree, and they were the ones who walked with God, and then you've got the daughters of Cain, who, he was a murderer, and so on and so forth, and was not calling upon God. And now what we have here in Genesis chapter 6, verse chapter 1, is you got these two groups. You got like the I won't say religious group, but the God-fearing group and the non-God-fearing group. In verse 2, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, took them wives of all which they chose. And as a result, we have this, the contamination of Seth's line, as it were, with sin and corruption, and it drags mankind into all kinds of issues and so forth. I always wondered why they didn't pick on that theory, because it paints all the women out in the bad light, doesn't it? It's like, oh, the guys, the men of Seth, they were doing okay. It was this lousy daughters of Cain that messed everything up. At any rate, you do have some issues, and by the time we get down, you're going to find out that this union results in giants. These giants are described later as being of significant stature. That's usually not a byproduct of an unequally yoked union, where a believer and a non-believer get married, and all of a sudden, we've got people being born. And then they'll argue that, well, they're giants not in stature so much, but in whatever. And for the record, I don't subscribe to that. I don't really think there's a lot of argument here. Part of it is that the phrase sons of God typically is used to describe the angelic host. We've already looked at a couple of these, so I'm not going to take the time to look them all up. Job chapter 1, verse 6, we looked at when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan was among them. Also chapter 2, verse 1. We'll look at a couple other ones, though, just for the fun of it. Also in Job chapter 38, and verse 7, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy, and this is, if you back up, he's talking about verse 4, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding, who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest, or who has stretched a line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened, or who hath laid the cornerstone thereof? So it's all pre-creation. So the sons of God existed prior to the earth's foundations even being laid, and they were rejoicing in its creations. So they existed. It's not. This certainly wouldn't be a reference to mankind in this particular instance, but there's others as well. Psalm chapter 29. Verse 1, O Psalm of David, give unto the Lord, O ye mighty, give unto the Lord glory and strength. And as I recall correctly, you've got Ben. This is a compound word, the word mighty. Ben and El, son of God. So the word mighty there in the Hebrew is actually the phrase sons or son of God. And that one, Psalm 82. We looked at this one earlier. Verse 6, I have said ye are gods, and all of you are children. Ben, that's the son of, right? The Most High. Elion, which is the Most High God, but sons of God are sons of the Most High. And just one more for the fun of it. Psalm 89, verse 6. For who in the heaven can be compared unto the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty, and the word mighty here again is the word El, so it's not just referring to a group of people. It's the sons of God can be likened unto the Lord. So this keeps popping up, and I think we looked at that one a little bit earlier too, but it's popping up in these heavenly realms all the time, referring to the Elohim and so forth. The consistency of Scripture is that sons of God refers to an angelic race. Not to mention the fact that you've got some... okay, I have to ask permission. Can I just use New Testament, Old Testament in the generic sense for the sake of... I don't want anybody to start correcting me if I'm wrong, but in your traditional New Testament writings, there we go, you have reference to these sons of God and it being identified as angels, particularly even in this context. 2 Peter chapter 2 would be one of them. Like I said, I have a hunch most of you are on the same page probably with me, but it doesn't hurt to run through some of it again. I want to know I'm trying to decide where to start, because this is kind of an interesting section. If you start in verse 1 of chapter 2, it says, "But there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And many shall follow their pernicious ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. And through covetousness shall they with feigned words make merchandise of you, whose judgment now for a long time lingereth not, and their damnation slumbereth not. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment." So here we've got a specific instance where you've got heavenly beings committing some offense at some point in time. Question is when? Well, that gets answered for us in verse 5. "And spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly." So we've got a direct tie in there to this particular time frame and a specific reference to the angels that sinned. And if I'm not mistaken, that's actually almost a copy out of the book of Enoch there. The wording's a touch different, but there's almost a parallel passage. As we mentioned before, there's like quotations that we do find in some of the books. Jude also references this particular event, starting in verse 5. Well, verse 4. Oh, except I need to get there. Yeah, 5. "I will therefore put you in remembrance, though you once knew this." I thought that some of the wording's kind of fascinating. You once knew this, but had they forgotten? Because it's kind of interesting. It's like recalling it to mind. "I will therefore put you in remembrance, though you once knew this, how that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterwards destroyed them that believed not. And the angels, which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day." So you've got another reference to these angels committing this offense. This one doesn't necessarily tie it as closely into Noah's time specifically, but we're going to see that they did leave their habitation or their estate, as it were, and started mingling in things that were not theirs to be mingled in or among. And let's see, since we're up here, why not? Is it 1 Peter chapter 3 is usually brought into this subject as well. Is it chapter 3? Yeah. Referring to Christ, after Christ died, while he was buried, starting in verse 18, it says, "For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water." So we've got this whole context of these angels that have sinned. Back in the days of Noah, they committed something wrong. The interesting thing about, I should double back there real quick. Jude kind of seems to put it in the context of what they did wrong, because Peter just says they sinned, so on and so forth. But if you go back to Jude, it's fascinating. He's talking about false teachers and so forth and things that crept in. But we read verse 6, the angels which kept not their first estate, left their own habitation, he's reserved in chains unto judgment. Verse 7, "Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering vengeance of eternal life." Even as Sodom and Gomorrah, seems like he's comparing the offense to something else that would trigger in our minds, that being of sexual immorality. So these angels apparently seem to be connected with this thing. And I know I brought it up. I probably find it faster. I was going to read you the verse that's a direct quote. Where's the one where he brings up the word ungodly? Oh, here, verse 15. If you want to know the direct quote from the book of 1 Enoch, it says, Jude, verse 15, "To execute judgment upon all and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." And let me check real fast. I don't know if I brought that page with me. I actually have the direct translation for that verse from 1 Enoch in a set of notes, and it's amazing how it's almost word for word. I don't think I've got that one on me at the moment. So I apologize for that. But I could actually tell you the reference in 1 Enoch where that's found. But that's virtually a direct quote, just to kind of tie together back to what I was saying. But either way, point being, when you get to Genesis chapter 6, there seems to be a ton of biblical evidence that the sons of God that are being brought up here are not only your angelic host, or your Elohim as it were, but that they came down and committed some offense. And what was the offense? Well, it starts off that they saw the sons of God, or the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives, of all which they chose. And I've actually been told that the idea of a wife isn't necessarily implied there. Basically, they wanted to get with someone, they just did it. It didn't involve a marriage ceremony per se necessarily. So it's kind of, and maybe it was, but it's a pretty generic word from what I understand. Either way, there's a result of this that takes place. Verse 3, there's a little bit of an insert here. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And by this point in time, verse 5, God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. So by the time we've gotten to this stage, mankind is so completely gone backslidden in regards to their relationship with God that God's pretty much about ready to wipe the slate clean and start over, more or less. That's about what he's going to do. But it seems like there's a pretty strong connection with this pushing, like the straw that broke the camel's back element, as it were, between this instance with the sons of God and the daughters of men. And I'm going to wander off my positional stance on this, as far as here I'll die on this hill type thing. But someone pointed something interesting out to me one time, so I'll share it with you, that the big question is, when did this start happening? Because, I mean, how far back did it go to get to this point? And when we start wandering our way through all of these so-and-so begat so-and-sos and so on and so forth, there is an interesting one, and I got to find it. Where is, there it is. Genesis chapter 4. You've got basically the progression of Cain, starting in verse 16. It says, and Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. This would not be the Enoch who is not, for God took him, a different Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mehujael, and Mehujael begat Methusael, and Methusael begat Lamech. And Lamech took unto him two wives. The name of one was Adah, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Adah bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. His brother's name was Jubal. He is the father of all as such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And this is really a bad thing to do, I realize, when you're looking at this and go, oh, that's right, I always wanted to check that. Here's a theory, and then we'll check it together, and I'll see what's going on. So if you look at what the book of Enoch says, one of the things that these sons of God did when they came down is they not only married the daughters of men, but they also gave mankind a whole bunch of information and knowledge that they didn't previously have. Stuff like, it actually identifies who was responsible for what and sharing information, but weapons of destruction, more or less it was self-destructive knowledge, how to abuse certain plant life to make narcotics and different things like that. All this information is allegedly came from, or was sourced back to these sons of God, or the Watchers, I think as Enoch refers to them as introducing mankind to these things. Because all of a sudden mankind, even historically and through fossils, they say it's like there was this not prehistoric, but kind of that, what's the word I'm looking for? Low-tech life going on. And all of a sudden, there's this sudden ramp up where things just start developing like crazy. And one person said he wondered if it was right around this time with Lamech that this took place, because all of a sudden you've got individuals specifically called out who are now developing technologies. You got the tents, the living dwelling locations. Some of it was more generic in knowledge, But the brass and working with metals and so on and so forth, I'm just, like I said, I'm throwing it out as just something I heard I thought was interesting. And what they also said was is supposedly, it actually names Lamech's daughter. What was her name? Naamah. And we can check together. Pleasantness or beautiful. And it's not that there's a direct connection, but it's interesting that they noticed that the daughters of men were beautiful. And what her name actually is pleasantness or beautiful. Like I said, not going to build a doctrine on it, but kind of an interesting thing to chew on as far as a little subcategory. So anyway, somewhere along the way it kicked in. That's the end. That's the bottom line. And we wind up with these offspring, the giants in the earth. And the word giant here is our word Nephil, or Nephilim is where we get our word for that. And these guys are described in a specific way. Says that at the end of the verse there that they became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And it seemed to be something of great stature. And we learn a little bit more about these Nephilim in other locations. For example, Numbers chapter 13, we get a bit more of a description of what these guys were actually like. Numbers chapter 13 and verse 33. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And there's a Gibor, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, as we were in our own sight. And there's our word Nephilim. There we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. And of course, that stemmed, I don't want to wander too far down these trails, but there's always the big debate, how big were the giants? And I've heard everything from hundreds of feet tall to mildly bigger than the average human being. Apparently the Septuagint reading for the, we always know, is it 6 cubits in a span? Is that Goliath's height? I think according to the Masoretic text. I believe it's the Septuagint says he was 4 cubits in a span, which puts him closer to 6.5 feet, roughly around 7. But they say the average height of an Israelite in those days was about 5'2", 5'3". So regardless of whether he, and some actually say that Goliath was like 18 feet tall if you use a certain cubit metric to measure. Nobody really honestly knows. We've got findings and stuff. I know Dwight's dug into, showed pictures of some of that. So there's really good arguments they were of substantial stature. Point being, they were big enough to make them feel pretty insignificant because they didn't just say, hey, we felt like young kids. No, they felt like grasshoppers. So they're pretty small. So one of these things with these Nephilim is that they're rather large. They were known to be tremendous warriors, hence the Goliath thing. Oftentimes they were kings of their domains and so forth. And so thus the wording here that they were mighty men of old would make some sense. I am going to come back to men of renown here in a second. But let's just follow this track up, because everybody wants to know what happened to the giants. Well, the biggest question that pops up is, God brought the flood on to destroy the giants. How did they get back afterwards? And I've been told that, according to the grammar, when it says there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, and also after that can't mean post-flood. I don't understand why it works that way, so that's always how I've held on to it. The thought process is if God took these angels that sinned, we just saw how he cast them into prison in Tartarus, he's holding them, it's the Greek word there, then how did this relaunch after the flood started? I thought, if something ain't broke, why fix it, right? If they came that close to eradicating mankind and getting God to bail on the whole system, wouldn't you take another crack at it? Why didn't, because there have been more sons of God who came, and we don't know when the imprisonment took place. It could have happened after the flood, and they started things up again. We don't know those details. All I can tell you is that they did show back up after the flood, and they play a pretty important part in what's going to take place. As Abraham is called, and God's starting to establish the nation of Israel through him, and that takes some time. You got Abraham, you got Isaac, you got Jacob. Jacob and the 12 sons, they go down to Egypt. They spend, 400 years roughly down there? It's a pretty sizable gap. But God has promised Abraham a land way back in the beginning. And it seems that our Nakash, our serpent from back in Genesis chapter 3, who's expecting the seed of the woman to come and destroy him, knows, hey, there's something significant about this territory because God's going to give it to them. So he's going to throw up a way to try to keep them out. So he sends the giants. The giants start to inhabit this area quite heavily. And I believe that if nothing, if for one reason, could very likely be to be a deterrent for the Israelites to want to enter the land. And the reason I believe that was a possibility is because that's exactly what it did. We were looking at Numbers chapter 13. Numbers 13, yep. And this is right after the spies go into the land. And of course, they bring back an evil report. Let's see, is that chapter 14? Basically, the 10 spies say, yeah, we can't take it. Joshua and Caleb say, yeah, we can take it. And the people side with the 10, right? And I don't have time to go into all that detail. You can look at it, but basically because of their faithlessness in God, God says, okay, fine, none of you are going to the land. You're going to wander. Anybody over the age of 20 isn't going to enter except for Joshua and Caleb, the two who stayed true to me. Well, that worked out really well, didn't it? If you're trying to prevent God from performing or holding up on his promises. And this was performed not just by one family of giants, but many. There are many different clans of giants. You've got Deuteronomy chapter 2. We got a whole bunch of them listed off, starting in verse 10. Well, here, let's start in verse 9. And the Lord said unto me, distress not the Moabites, neither contend with them in battle, for I will not give of thee of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar unto the children of Lot for a possession. So it's kind of interesting. God's saying, hey, leave those guys alone. They're getting what they're getting because I told them they could have it. However, verse 10, the Emims dwelt therein in time past, a people great and many and tall as the Anakims. There's our tie back to the giants. We had the sons of Anak, which were mentioned as being one of the giants. I think we got Rephaim right here in the next verse too, which also were accounted Rephaim as the Anakims, but the Moabites call them Emims. The Horims also dwelt there in Seir before time. We could go down. Basically, it's laying out a lot of the destruction of the giants within that particular region in that area. This would have been east of the Jordan, not what we would normally consider occupied Israel. But the giants were kind of a thorn in the side of Israel for a long time. Let's look at Joshua chapter 11. And one of the things that the Israelites start to do when they do go into the land is start to break up and exterminate these giant clans. And hence you've got reasons why God tells them at some points in time to go in and destroy everybody, man, woman, child. And other times he tells them not to. And in my experience, you can tie all the ones that he ordered mass genocide for to being connected to the giant clans. Joshua chapter 11, verse 21. And at that time came Joshua and cut off the Anakims from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. There was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod there remained. Of course, that's where Goliath hailed from. If you drop down to chapter 14, and let's look at verse 12. Excuse me. Now therefore give me this mountain whereof the Lord spake in that day, for thou heardest in that day how the Anakims were there, and that the cities were great and fenced. If so be the Lord will be with me, then I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. And Joshua blessed him and gave unto Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Hebron for an inheritance. Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite unto this day, because that he wholly followed the Lord God of Israel. So, and the name of Hebron before was Kirjatharba, which Arba was a great man among the Anakims, and the land had rest from war. So we've got the extermination of those places. All these things have been destroyed. As a matter of it's funny. It just answers so many things. You go back, let's see, we were in Deuteronomy chapter 2 a minute ago. He was talking about as Israel's getting ready to go up to the land of the promised land. They started down in the wilderness, the Sinai Peninsula area. The easiest way to get there would have just been gone straight north into it. But God doesn't do that. He takes them east of the land, all the way to the north side, and then they enter in up at Jericho on the north end of the promised land, and then conquer on the way down. Well, why would you take the long route along the way? Well, part of it was to clean up some messes that needed to be dealt with. This list of giants, some of the other people had taken care of, but there was still a number of giants that needed to be dealt with on that side of the river. And this would be the area, is it Dan? Who were the two tribes that settled on the east side? I think Dan was one.
Half tribe of Manasseh.
Is that what it was? Dan? Yeah. I could be wrong.
Well, half of Manasseh.
Half of Manasseh.
Yeah.
Dan.
Ephraim, wasn't it? Was it Ephraim?
Either way, you guys get the point. You know what I'm talking about, even if you don't know who necessarily. But these lands that they're going through, and they start conquering and taking, were actually inhabited by the giants that were still left, even after God used a lot of the other peoples around the area to clean house. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, down in, I'll start in verse 27. Basically, Moses is asking permission at this point to journey through these other territories. Basically, hey, we'll stay on the road, we won't eat your food, whatever. We're just trying to pass through, right? Verse 27, it says, let me pass through thy land. Verse 26, we'll start there. I sent messengers out of the wilderness of Kedemoth unto Sihon, king of Heshbon, with words of peace, saying, let me pass through thy land. I will go along by the highway, and I will neither turn unto the right hand nor to the left. Thou shalt sell me meat for money, that I may eat. Give me water for money, that I may drink. Only I will pass through on my feet. As the children of Esau, which dwelt in Seir, and the Moabites, which dwelt in Ar, did unto me. So previously to this, he had passed through Seir and Ar, and those individuals had let them go through. They bought what they needed, didn't molest them. Now he's gotten to Sihon, the king of Heshbon. He sends the same message over to him. Basically, he wants to just until he can pass over the Jordan. Verse 30, but Sihon, king of Heshbon, would not let us pass by him. For the Lord thy God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate, that he might deliver him into thy hand, as appeareth this day. Well, why would God pick on Sihon, the king of Heshbon, when he let the other two kings let him go through freely? Well, let's keep going. Then Sihon, verse 32, came out against us, he and all his people, to fight at Jahaz. And the Lord our God delivered him before us, and we smote him and his sons and all his people, and we took all his cities at that time, and utterly destroyed the men and the women and the little ones of every city. We left none to remain. Only the cattle we took for a prey unto ourselves, and the spoil of the cities which we took, from Aroer, which is by the brink of the river of Arnon, and from the city that is by the river even unto Gilead. There was not one city too strong for us. The Lord our God delivered all unto us. Only unto the land of the children of Ammon thou camest not, nor unto any place of the river Jabbok, nor unto the cities in the mountains, nor unto whatsoever the Lord our God forbade us. So permission is requested, and permission is declined. Now, do we know anything about this king of Sihon? Well, he's an Amorite king. One of the interesting things about the Amorites is you go back to Genesis chapter 15. And God's talking to Abraham here, Abram, I should say. And this is the one where I think he cuts up the animals. He's got it in pieces, and he's driving all the animals away, but eventually he falls asleep. And starting in verse 13, it says, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried. Where? It doesn't feel like the one I wanted. Verse 16. Oh, I'm sorry, yep, I was getting there. Verse 15, and thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Kind of an odd statement, just in the middle of the blue there. But what happens after his people go down, they serve for 400 years, they come out and they're delivered. What are the first thing they do? They go and deal with the Amorites, whose iniquity apparently is now full, because God's now exterminating. And Sihon is the king of the Amorites, and they were part of this iniquity. Now also, back in Deuteronomy chapter 2, let's see if I can find it. There's a particular one I'm looking for. 31 through 37. Okay, we read that. No, sorry, we'll double back here. We read that story in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 31 through 33, but let's go to Amos chapter 2. That's the next one. Amos chapter 2. We get another little input to Sihon and the Ammonites. Amos chapter 2, starting in verse 9. Yet I destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit from above and his roots from beneath. Also I brought you up from the land of Egypt and led you 40 years to the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorite. So what's the description of the Amorites that were dwelling in the region related to Sihon, king of Heshbon? Well, they were great and tall at the height of the cedars and strong as the oaks. It does appear like they had some giant DNA potentially running through the bloodstream there. But then it picks back up. It's not done yet. Chapter 3 picks up in Deuteronomy there. Then we turned and went up the way to Bashan. And Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. And the Lord said unto me, Fear him not, for I will deliver him and all his people into his and his land into thy hand, and thou shalt do unto him as thou didst unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, which dwelt at Heshbon. So the Lord our God delivered into our hands Og, also the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we smote him until none was left of him remaining. We took all of his cities, same story. Verse 5, all these cities were fenced with high walls, gates, and bars, being side-walled towns, a great many. We utterly destroyed them as we did unto Sihon, king of Heshbon, utterly destroying the men, women, and children of every city. Once again, this time they're allowed to take their livestock as possessions. I do want to just read one more stretch here a little bit. Verse 8, and we took at that time out of the hand of the two kings of the Amorites the land that was on this side Jordan, from the river Arnon unto Mount Hermon, which Hermon the Sidonians call Sirion, and the Amorites call Shinar. All the cities of the plain, and all Gilead, and all Bashan, unto Salach and Edrei, cities of the kingdom of Og in Bashan. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbath of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man. So now we got direct ties of Og being connected with these as a giant king. Now I wanted to read through all the cities and locations because Bashan, Mount Hermon, those kind of become a little bit of important players in this particular story. But even the city of Edrei is mentioned as something interesting. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 10, we read there, all the cities of the plain, and all Gilead, and all Bashan unto Salcah, and Edrei, cities of the kingdom of Og and Bashan. Just a little cross-reference here that's kind of fascinating. If we go to Joshua chapter 12, and let me make sure I got that right. Oh, not 45, 4 through 5. Start in verse, it's actually a rehashing of this event. Starting in verse 1, now these are the kings of the land which the children of Israel smote and possessed their land on the other side Jordan, toward the rising of the sun, from the river Arnon unto Mount Hermon and all the plain on the east. Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon. I want to drop down to, so he's just giving the list of the cities and locations. But you get down to verse 4, it says, in the coast of Og, king of Bashan, which was of the remnant of the giants that dwelt at Ashtaroth and at Edrei. So there's another link about the fact that he was kind of getting towards the end, because a lot of the nations on that side had already started wiping these giants out for whatever the various reasons. Verse 5, and he reigned in Mount Hermon and in Salcah and in all Bashan unto the border of the Geshurites and the Maacathites and half of Gilead, the border of Sihon, king of Heshbon. Fascinating that Og actually reigned from, it says, Mount Hermon. Now what's the significance of Mount Hermon? Well, for what it's worth, the book of Enoch claims that the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 actually descended onto Mount Hermon, and that's where they started their work amongst mankind. Mount Hermon's kind of got a notorious reputation for being associated with the giants and the sons of God who came down and started worship and created this corruption and so on and so forth. Interestingly, the word Bashan, let's see. You'll notice that Strong's doesn't give us a very clear definition for what Bashan means. To quote him, of uncertain derivation, a region east of the Jordan. No definition. I've been told, according to the manuscripts in the text of the peoples in the surrounding areas that go back to this time, Bashan was their word for snake or serpent. It was known of the region of the snake or region of the serpent, ironically. Take it as you will, but that's what if you go back to your manners, customs, and the peoples outside of Israel, it was a reference that led to them. And funny that you don't have any direct connection to that here. We're actually going to revisit Bashan in the next section, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself there. But let's talk a little bit about, let's double back to the sons of God, because where am I at here? We got a little bit more time. There's kind of your giants. Eventually, and then, we'll finish up with the giants real quick. There's this big debate, well, is it in 1 Samuel? David goes through and he kills off some of the remaining giants, and it says, and these were the last of the giants. So some theologians argue, well, that's it. There were no more giants after that point. Some will say, well, yeah, in the land of Israel, they were everywhere else by this point in time. It seems like there's a lot of evidence that the giants had expanded and broadened. We could talk more about that later on, but I do want to get back to, because the sons of God element is really where our spiritual warfare element comes in. The giants, the Rephaim, were definitely tools in that, but we have a real significant thing that starts to occur, and we're going to start to see a theme here for a little bit in the book of Genesis and how mankind latched onto these sons of God and the relationship that was created within this Genesis 6 event. Oh, by the way, because I teased I would talk about, I might bring up aliens. This is a good time to do it. So I actually saw something that was a non-biblical related thing, but it was kind of commenting on how there's a certain point, about the time that the ziggurats were all built around the world, that technology seemed equally known in a lot of different places around the world. They all had the same technology. How did it all spring through at the same time? And so, of course, aliens are the big, must have been some extraterrestrial life form that came down and gave them this information. Well, if the book of Enoch maybe is on par and they're teaching them, giving them information and stuff, wouldn't they all have had that information when this events took place? And rather than aliens being the ones who are guilty parties of passing this information on, could it be the sons of God? Interesting that society would rather go with aliens than try to reference any type of a biblical possibility. But there you go. I don't think the aliens helped build the pyramids, but the sons of God might have. And the Nephilim may have been very involved in that. And speaking of pyramids and stuff, or more specifically, I just said it. What were the structures? Ziggurats. Thank you. Speaking of ziggurats, in Genesis chapter 6, there's one more word I want to zero in here in verse 4. It's the one at the very end. It says that these giants were mighty men of old, men of renown. And we think of men of renown, we think of somebody who's important, did something noteworthy from a historical standpoint. The Hebrew word for renown is the word shem, and at its root, it basically means a name, something that marks you as conspicuous or belonging to somebody else. They're men of this distinction. Why is that important? All right, so we know the rest of the story. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. We know the rest of the story, right? Noah builds the ark. Mankind gets wiped out. I don't believe that one of Noah's daughter-in-laws carried Nephilim blood to the other side of the flood. It seems like it would have defeated the purpose for the flood. There's all kinds of discussion on that. Genesis chapter 9, Noah's off the ark. God says, go out, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, right? And mankind decides to break their trend of not paying attention to what God says to do, and they start following his orders, and everything goes happy-go-lucky and hunky-dory after that, right? It's after lunch. I figure I'd throw a question out. No, not quite. They settle into their same pattern. What happens shortly after the flood? Starting in verse 1 of Genesis 11, and the whole earth was of one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And for the record, the plain of Shinar is the eventual location of the city of Babylon. So the Tower of Babel would seem to be the foundational building point for Babylon. Whole other interesting conversation. Verse 3, it says, they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. First off, I don't think they were trying to build a tower that was going to go up past the stars, through the galaxies, to reach the throne room of God. They were trying to create a meeting place with the gods, which is actually based on all of the religions in the world who built ziggurats, the whole purpose. You built a mountain because the gods would come down to the mountain, even if it was man-made, and there you would do your thing with them. But here's what's interesting. Let us make us a tower whose top may reach into heaven. They want to reconnect with the heavens. And let us make us a name. There's our word shame again. Now, I might be pulling something out that's a little vague or distended, but the giants were men of the name. And by the time you get to Genesis 11, they're not following God's orders. They're not following his instructions. They're abandoning his worship. They're setting up a religious system, and they want to make a name for themselves. Could it possibly be that the stories had been passed down, and people are going, some of that stuff sounded pretty good. Let's do that again. And they want to be people of the name or the distinction. It's the exact same word. And for the record, is God ultra concerned about them, how well they did or didn't build a tower? They wanted something significant here because God takes extremely drastic measures. Verse 5, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men build, and the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. I'm speculating a touch, and I fully admit that, but if their objective was to reintroduce the sons of God worship and re-get things going, because we know the giants did pop in, and hey, for all I know, it was working. And God's saying, based on what happened pre-flood, if this just keeps on going, nothing's going to be restrained from them. It's going to be whatever. So he promised he wouldn't flood the earth again, but we need to do something dramatic to pull the plug on this. So, verse 7, go to, let us go down there and confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. God swoops in and pulls a plug on this. It's done, over, kaput. But here's what's interesting. He did something else at this point in time too. Let's go to Deuteronomy 32. Sorry, I'll catch up. Deuteronomy 32. Moses here is getting his last words in before Israel proceeds into the promised land as his life is coming to a close. And he's giving a little final admonition, starting in verse 6. Do ye thus requite the Lord, O foolish people and unwise? Is not he thy father that hath bought thee? Hath not he made thee and established thee? Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. So I want you to look way back in the memory banks here. Ask your thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, they will tell thee. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. And I think it was off camera, but we had a little conversation about where the Masoretic text, the Old Hebrew, the Dead Sea Scrolls have a little bit of a conflict, and here's one of them. Let's ask the question first of all, though. When did the Most High divide the nations? There's only one time that I know of that this occurred. Interestingly, if you go back to Genesis chapter 10, it's a list of all the nations. It ends with, these are the nations. And depending on who you listen to, most people say it's 70. A couple will argue it's 72. It just depends on a hyphen thing or something, whatever. 70 is generally the accepted number on that. And then we get the account of how it took place. These are the nations. Here's what went down. So God, it seems like, in my understanding, the moment he divided the nations according to their inheritance was at Babel. That's all well and good until we get to, it says he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. And your Masoretic text, that's exactly how it reads. You've got Israel right here. There's no tricky wording here. Here's the interesting part. The Dead Sea Scrolls say, according to the sons of God. So the Septuagint often becomes a tiebreaker. And you know what the Septuagint reads? According to the angels of God. So take that for how you will, but doesn't that make a little more sense? Now here, maybe we're reading a little bit between the lines. But at Babel, God says, okay, enough's enough. I'll divide you into nations. You came looking for these gods, I'll give them to you. But what happens after that? Verse 9, for the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. Who's the first person we're introduced to in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 after Babel's over? Abram. God calls Abram. And he starts calling and creating his own people from an old man and woman so that nobody could doubt that it was God doing this. And he gives the rest of the people over to the sons of God. For the record, in Psalm 82, why is he judging them? The sons of God. Hey, I've made thee gods. I've set thee over these people. Why are you ruling unjustly? Why are you dealing with these wickedness? You're going to be judged and die like men. They were put in positions of authority and they didn't hold up to it. Drop back to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Here's a situation where they're being told not to create any graven images. We started at a different time, so I'll try to wrap this up here before too long. We're getting close. Basically warning against idolatry, worshiping other gods, and so on and so forth. He says, starting in verse 15, take ye therefore good heed unto yourselves, for ye saw no manner of similitude on the day that the Lord spake unto you in Horeb out of the midst of the fire, lest ye corrupt yourselves and make you a graven image, the similitude of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any beast that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged fowl that it flieth in the air, the likeness of anything that creepeth on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water beneath the earth. For the record, I think if I remember correctly, you go to Romans chapter 1, and it says they changed the image of God into a corruptible image. It runs down that same list. It just doesn't use the fish at the end. Same order, same progression. But anyway, the likeness, verse 18, of anything that creepeth on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the waters beneath the earth. Verse 19, here we go. Unless thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when thou seest the sun and the moon and the stars, even all the host of heaven, shouldest be driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord thy God hath divided unto all nations under the whole heaven. You want to worship this stuff? Go for it. I'm done. You failed me in Eden. You failed me at the flood. You're failing me at Babel. If you don't want me that badly, go do your own thing. But not to pull the plug on humanity completely, I'm going to keep a people for myself. That's the next verse, verse 20. But the Lord hath taken you and brought you forth out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt, to be unto him a people of inheritance, as ye are this day. And to go dispensational on us for a moment here, what's Israel's purpose eventually? To be a kingdom of priests, a light unto the nations. The goal for Israel was not to be this little isolated unit that worshiped God. No, it's God leaving an opportunity for man who, if any of the Gentiles wanted to come seek him, any of the members of the nations wanted to come find him, they would know where to look. And if Israel did their job, it'd be very easy to find him because he was going to bless Israel like no other, which would encourage the nations to come find them. But in the meantime, if the nations don't want anything to do with it, I'm going to confuse your languages, I'm going to scatter you throughout the rest of the world, and I'm going to start working with a people of my own. Now, if you really want to start playing around with some stuff, here's where it gets kind of fun. What happens at Pentecost? Is it the fulfillment of Israel's purpose starting to come to play? The kingdom's ready to be offered, right? They're ready to be the priests. Jesus has died. We're ready to enter the tribulation period. He's going to reach out to those Gentiles. So what does he do? He brings Jews and proselytes from every nation, show up in Jerusalem. The language barrier is reversed so that the message can go out so all those people could take it home as time is coming up to an end for Israel to step in and do their job. The problem was Israel didn't step up and do their job. And we'll play around with some of this stuff a little bit more coming up. But here's where the transition changes, and here's why I say spiritual warfare has had an impact on getting us to where we are today. Israel would have, Israel is a direct result of the nations rejecting him. He sets them aside, he divides them up, and starts his own people. Isn't it interesting in Ephesians chapter 1 that we're now described as members of the body of Christ as God's inheritance? The wording is interesting there because the nations were the inheritance of the gods back at this point in time. But now under grace, and we'll see this transition come up, coming up this weekend, God reverses that and he makes a way open for all the Gentiles to come directly to him. And now regardless of race or nationality, you can be the inheritance of God. That's why we are his inheritance and he is ours. The inheritance notion starts all the way back up here with Israel, and it's a result of the sons of God and people's desire to bring them in, it would appear, to their worship system and religious systems and so forth. So it doesn't just end in Genesis chapter 6. Babel has an impact on it, and now we start up with Israel. And we're going to wrap up with this for now, but we're going to pick up with the next one. I'm going to jump largely through Israel's history and get to the end of it, to the culmination of what their purpose and function really was, and see how they did or did not succeed. But when Christ is on earth, we see a big culmination heading together. So we'll play with that in the next session here in a little bit. But let's stop with that for now.